the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These are the forces which come together to make up our human experience. The Father is the order that is in this imperfect world, with all its corruption, apathy, and sin. But the Father who art in heaven is the order that could be if we could see the light in the darkness leading the way to it, and made the necessary sacrifices to create a genuine chance at approaching it. And that's where we come to the Son, the human force that dares to challenge the Father on earth, pointing out the corruption, the selfish lies about the true nature of this world, and preaching about a better way, being a light in the darkness to those who have suffered blindly. The archetypical embodiment of this in the West is the Uberman, but that never really gained mass appeal, so it's Jesus Christ, the Son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Father in heaven. Jesus is actually an everyman sort of name. It was originally Yeshua or Joshua, so his friends called him Josh. And Christ is more of a title. Basically, he was a teacher. And by the way, he was a stonemason, not a carpenter. He lived in the desert, so his real dad could be the milkman, a cowboy from hell. It doesn't even matter. He's meant to be relatable. He's not even the first of his archetype, but he is the Son of God. And he spreads the message that through him is the true light and the way to heaven on earth. But the Father on earth, this imperfect world, isn't just going to take this implied disrespect and threat to his power lying down. Jesus actually cured a man's blindness by using water from his body in the form of spit. He just mixed it with dirt and gave him one of those spa mud facials. He was really only cured of his blindness after washing the mud off though. Anyone with experience in like poverty and broken home situations might guess the meaning to that sort of blindness. And as for walking on water, while the sea represents chaos, to simply walk over it like that represents a high degree of mastery over nature. The cosmological era of Pisces was rolling in. You know, the fish. And there was a feeling that it was time for a change into something that worked better for the people, which Jesus came to embody the hope for. So the powers that be wanted him and his message dead. Those powers actually being the Pharisees, the priesthood class of Judea. You see, the Judeans had a reputation for violent revolts against the Roman rulers, and the Pharisees had the power to call for one. And they used this to blackmail Pontius Pilate into prosecuting their rival, Jesus, who they clearly felt threatened by because he was going around doing all this crazy stuff with water, and claiming that the light and the truth will come through him. I mean, like, how many video games do you know where the modding community produces better content than the actual studio? They gotta protect their cartel. Jesus may have had the option to choose violence, take what followers he can, and try and take out the Pharisees as fast as he can before it all blows up. The Romans wouldn't even care as long as things remain stable and the taxes are paid. But the Pharisees are like that. They would likely immediately move to set off a large-scale revolt and blame the whole thing on Jesus and position themselves as the Romans' best tool for regaining stability in the province. So it really just depends on how fast Jesus could pull out that tablecloth, you know? Now, of course, it was Jesus' disciple Judas who identified Jesus to the Roman guards in exchange for a minuscule amount of silver. And as much as we'd like to otherize him, what Judas represents is an aspect of weakness found within the Son, the desire to not face such a hard destiny and to benefit, even if in some tiny pathetic way, from selling out and serving the status quo. So after receiving the Judas kiss and being arrested, Jesus was scourged by Pontius. Like, they really made an example of him. They had to flip him over when they ran out of virgin flesh to shred on his back. It was almost not homoerotic. Jesus was then made to carry his own cross to a hill outside of town. Accounts vary on the weight of this cross. Some say it was only 90 pounds, but still awkward, like a fun-sized girlfriend. But in a more common telling of this event, the cross was 170 pounds, just about a workout-sized girlfriend. Jesus actually fails to carry this cross the entire way, stumbling and falling, and failing to get up, no matter how persuasive the Roman soldiers got. So they made this random passerby Simon carry it for him. And the story goes into detail about how Simon decided to have a good attitude about the whole thing. It's a lesson about the brotherly feeling when you help your fellow man to carry his burdens just a little bit when he's down. But honestly, it's like, really? This guy Jesus is supposed to be the archetype, but he can't carry his own cross, the intersection and conflict of the different forces that make up his soul the whole way. Jesus didn't even lift while he was doing this whole Messiah thing, so now he's got to listen to Simon mumbling, "Lean on me," the rest of the way. That thing was just too big, too thick, and too rough to be called a cross. It was more like a railroad track of destiny. So when they got to the hill, the cross was erected and Jesus had to do the Roman T-pose. Jesus was really not an unbreakable man. In fact, in one of the tellings, which the church later decided was not going to be canon, because they do that, Jesus and the apostles had seriously considered finding a body double to go through all this in his place. Anyways, he was the Son of God in the sense that he carried the message and the light, but he still had the weaknesses of man. And when his suffering on the cross started getting really intense, he cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" But it's not that the Father in heaven had abandoned Jesus to suffer pointlessly. It was his fate to be sacrificed in exchange for a chance at creating a more heavenly and enlightened order on earth. Only the blood of the Son can cleanse the sins of the corrupted earthly father. This very blood ran down the spear shaft of the Roman centurion Longinus as he pierced Jesus on the right side to confirm death. And not just blood, but cleansing water. This blood and water coated the spear and also splashed onto the face of Longinus, who was losing his vision to cataracts, but now his eyes were opened by the sacrifice of a man who claimed to be a representative of a heavenly order that could exist on earth, and he became one of Christ's most ardent believers. This spear of Longinus, also known as the Holy Lance, or my favorite term, the Spear of Destiny, was unceremoniously returned to the local armory, coated in the blood of the sacrificial son and the cleansing water that allowed one to see the light. It was believed that whoever controlled the spear had the power to predict future events and to usher in a new era, an order on earth which is better, because they're in charge now, getting all the bitches. So the Roman Emperor Constantine is the one who made Christianity the official ideology of the empire, laying the framework for the Vatican, the religious head of Western Europe for many centuries. And it was actually Constantine's mother who traveled to the Holy Land with a team of archaeologists. It had been about 300 years, but she found the true cross and the nails which suspended Jesus. Some say that Jesus was actually tied to the cross, and what she found was the rope. But that's just not hardcore enough. And besides, some New Testament sources point towards blood coming out of Jesus' palms. She also found the crown of thorns and the spear, which had previously gone missing during the Jewish revolts. Constantine's mother would become known as Helena of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, which was founded and named after her son. In fact, Constantine had forged a new spear out of the nails, which he used to trace the boundaries of this new city. Of course, the metal of these nails would also have power over destiny because they were also soaked in Jesus' blood. And indeed, the Eastern Empire would last for many centuries more than the West, as the West had become decadent and depraved, and relied too much on soldiers of foreign blood to maintain their borders. In Constantine's day, though, it is said he had many victories in battle while wielding the spear. Although which spear he used, the original or the nail spear, is unclear. Some even say that there was no second spear, and he upgraded the tip of the original using a nail. In fact, there's a lot of narratives to try and forge together here, so let's just go with that. He also had made for himself a set of armor using metal from the nails. And his nail armor was powerful enough to change the fate of the armor fashion world. All of a sudden, female video game armor became canon. Word of the significance of the spear would spread far and wide. When Attila the Hun invaded the empire from the east, the spear was on his list of demands. In one telling, Attila actually took the spear into his possession, but eventually threw it at the feet of some Roman soldiers, saying he couldn't use it since he did not know the one who made it holy. Then he left Rome to conquer in other directions, but died mysteriously shortly afterwards. The next major appearance of the Spear of Destiny was in the hands of the Frankish king Charlemagne. It is said he was gifted the spear by the Pope as he forged his empire in the West, so he could do it in the name of Christendom. Charlemagne is also said to have wielded a sword, which took a highly skilled blacksmith 3 years to make for him. It was called Joyous, which if translated to English roughly means I'm so gosh darn happy. He brought his family's Carolingian empire to its greatest extent, and is known as the father of Europe, if you catch my drift. The sword Joyous was said to be as bright as the sun, blinding his enemies, and that this light actually changed in color 30 times a day. It also grants the wielder an immunity to poison. And in its pommel, there was a place for storing the tip of the Spear of Destiny. By the way, pommel originates from a Latin term meaning apple, and an apple is often used as a symbol for fertility and also death. So this sword, which was usually remarked on for the act of lopping off the heads of enemy generals, usually Saracens, could also possess the power of the spear over destiny and seeing the path to a new order. He did also just use the spear though, and it won him many battles. However, this spear, with its power over destiny, demands a wielder who is worthy, and also to be treated with reverence and respect. Otherwise, the consequences could be dire. Charlemagne met his end a few days after dropping the spear while crossing a river. It was most likely a mistake. He probably just slipped on a mossy rock, but I think you'll find that destiny doesn't care. He had laid the first foundation for the Holy Roman Empire, which would serve as the spear tip of the church, so to speak. The spear then began to change hands rapidly between kings as a valuable bargaining chip. Henry I, the founder of Germany for instance, traded the territory of Switzerland to gain the spear. Henry believed himself to be destined to head the new Holy Roman Empire. The Pope in Rome disagreed with this notion and protested, but the Pope didn't have the spear. The Western Roman Empire was now German. Get over it, you bigot. Henry's son Otto defeated the Poles, because of course he did, and also the Hungarians while possessing the spear. And then with his eyes open, he did a big brain move. He commissioned copies of the spear to be made, and then had them touch tips with the original. And these copies he gave out to the kings of Poland and Hungary, in the spirit of friendship. They now shared destinies to some degree. However, as the wielder of the Master Spear, he had more power to direct this destiny. Otto now began to think of himself as something more than just a king. His grandson, Otto III, would further enhance the spear by adding another nail from the cross to it. His family had been collecting these sorts of relics for generations at this point, and they just kept winning. Not without any slip-ups though. The king Frederick Barbarossa dropped the spear while crossing a river, and you know what happened after that. It seems like river crossings are places where destiny can be swept aside. It was Barbarossa who had officially founded the Holy Roman Empire. By his time, the church was again exerting a level of control over the spear by playing lip service to German legitimacy, but Barb was having none of that. He severed those ties by disrespecting and arm-twisting the popes to his whims. Barbarossa was like, I submit to St. Peter, not this clown of a pope, while being declared the HRE. And the pope was so dumbfounded that he didn't have the wits to tell the king that to fully submit to St. Peter, it is preferential to bend over rather than kneel. The position of Holy Roman Emperor of this thing would become not hereditary but elected by peers. That is, until the Habsburg family, with their seat in Austria, would have the balls to make it an official family thing again. They also had the balls to keep busting in their sisters and cousins to make it a very family thing. But back to the spear. Around the year 1350, Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV added a golden sleeve to the spear. There were other spears of destiny though, which would appear now and then with no logical link to this one, aside from it appearing on the winning side of major battles. Almost as if it had a will of its own, and it had to go and move a few pieces around to shape a larger destiny. During the Crusades, the Christian soldiers had just taken the city of Antioch, when they were besieged themselves by a larger Muslim force. It wasn't looking good for them until one soldier had a vision and started digging under St. Anthony's Cathedral. There he found the original Spear of Destiny, which inspired the outnumbered, exhausted, and starved Christian army to break the siege and win that day. This spear's claim to be the original conflicted with the original spear being held in Constantinople at the time, and the Armenians also claimed to have the true spear. Seriously, what is the Armenian woman Anna Kasparian doing on a show called The Young Turks? I don't think they have the true spear. All three of these originals would find their way into the possession of the kings of France. Jump ahead to the French Revolution in the early 1800s. Two of these spears go completely missing in the chaos, and only the broken tip of the Spear of Antioch remains. Shortly afterwards, Napoleon sets off to conquer Europe in the name of the Enlightenment. He takes Austria, which marked the end of the Holy Roman Empire, and he very much tried to acquire the spear of the German kings and emperors. But they managed to smuggle it away from his grasp just in time. 1,000 years of French-dominated Europe wasn't going to happen. And in fact, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck would create a resurgence in German power, this time based in Prussia at the turn of the century. The spear had made its way from the Austrian Habsburg family to the Prussian kings, whom Bismarck served. And this was the actual Second Reich, by the way. The Holy Roman Empire was a barely unified mess that would have toppled even without Napoleon. The HRE was such a gridlock of competing factions that you could run on a strong platform by promising not to do anything at all. So this Second Reich fell into the hands of King Wilhelm II. He was Queen Victoria's grandson and the ass in the throne during World War I. But despite carrying the spear, it soon became clear that he was not worthy. It really seemed that Otto had been carrying the team this whole time with his sheer lack of incompetence. As for Wilhelm II, he was forced to abdicate due to a revolution and also due to just no one was following his orders anymore.
You have failed me for the last time.
A mutiny or a lynching were his only options if he stayed king. And the spear was returned to the Habsburg family in Austria. And they really didn't do anything with it. I mean, they had held power in the HRE for about 350 years total, and they're still wealthy, so they were probably thinking maybe we'll just chill for a while. Maybe just cut back on the incest, fade into the shadows, and use the spear to somehow seek power and build harems there. But then Hitler annexed Austria and took the spear. He kept it at Nuremberg and displayed it at rallies as a symbol of German empire. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, though, was more interested in uncovering the secrets to this and other artifacts, and he set up an organization to this end in the church where the German kings have collected their relics for centuries. When he requested the spear from Hitler, though, for closer study, he only got a copy. I mean, I'm sure they touched tips, but Hitler needed the spear. Even with leaded gasoline, a successful invasion of Poland is not actually a guarantee. Or taking over France so fast that Americans still call them pussies to this day. Which is an unfair assessment, by the way, but they certainly weren't ready. Anyways, when the war was coming to a close and the Americans were rolling in, the American general Mark Clark found a holding place for the spear underneath the Nuremberg fortress. But the spear wasn't actually there. Eventually, though, some German soldiers came forward with the spear, saying that it had been hidden within the walls of an underground bunker. It seemed that Hitler, that meth-addicted German Mr. Bean, was not worthy either. He didn't even keep the spear close. The Germans had taken Western Europe and did a lot of asset consolidation, which did lay the framework for the EU, the IMF, and so forth. But for Hitler, it was like, now what? Think about it from his perspective. The Brits, or should I rather say, their fellow Germanic Anglos, had rejected his peace offer. The Japs had just ruined every bit of American isolationism, and the Russians appear to be just waiting for the other two to strike before breaking their treaty with Germany and charging west. Instead of another 1,000-year empire with a eugenics facelift, it was instead only a few years. He didn't really have much control over destiny to be stuck in that now what situation. There's a rumor that Hitler blew his brains out the moment the Americans found the spear, but that doesn't really add up since they actually acquired it months after the war. So perhaps Hitler slipped on a mossy rock while on a cocaine jog through the Peruvian mountains. Anyways, currently this spear rests in the Hofburg Museum, which is in Vienna, the capital of Austria, and a copy exists in Poland. Some have put forward though that the Americans held onto the original and the one in Vienna is a copy. The Armenian spear has been returned to Armenia, and the Vatican has the tip of what they claim to be the original, which the Pope had received as a gift from the Ottoman Sultan who had just taken Constantinople. Kinda feels like a flex, and also I thought the Christian invasions already cleaned that city out of true spears. Either way, copies have power too. We don't even need dragons in this world to make dragon dildos. It's the power of the idea of dragons. Fun fact, the name Longinus can actually be translated into spearman. I also think it's a missed opportunity for the naming of the male organ. But yeah, you could technically call this object the Spear of Spearman. Now let's go over the abilities of the Spear of Destiny. The blood and water of the Son of God grants one worthy great clairvoyance, as well as power over destiny to forge an empire that lasts many centuries. There are other spears which may share some of its power, depending on how much reverence people give to them, and it can even appear spontaneously to influence the outcome of certain battles and shape history. The spear can be tapped onto copies of adequate make, and thereby share some of its power. But really, this serves the purpose of bringing the receivers of these copy spears in line with the destiny of the wielder of the master spear, the one spear to rule them all. The head of the spear can also be inserted into the pommel of the sword Joyous, which can blind enemies, make one immune to poison, and is also said to have general combat buffs, making it much harder to interrupt the wielder's destiny with either plotting or skill in combat. The one major weakness of the spear though is that you cannot fail to treat it with respect and reverence, or destiny will turn on you. Now so far I've talked about the forces of the Father and the Son and their relationship, but what of the Holy Spirit? What is it? Well, to put it simply, it's feminine chaos. Think Pandora's box. It's also the beginning and the end, because both represent a transition between chaos and order, as far as our human experience is concerned. It is the mother and child idols, and also the Catholic portals that look suspiciously like vaginas. There is also the female figure who takes those who have died by the hand and leads them into the blackness. For the ancient Norse, the goddess Hel presided over the underworld, also known as Hell. There, the Allfather Odin dictates that she should preside over all who have died from old age or sickness. For warriors who die in battle, it's the Valkyrie who take them by the hand to Valhalla. In Hinduism, the goddess Kali presides over chaos, death, and birth. In Buddhism, when one's mortal body fails, the goddess Guan Yin places them in the heart of a lotus, and then they are sent to the western Pure Land of bliss. In the Witcher book, The Sword of Destiny, the Witcher series being heavily based on European stories, the main character Geralt, who at the time is seriously injured and should be resting, travels up a hill to visit a memorial site, and in a fever dream he meets a woman. She's depicted as a child for some reason in this piece of art, but you get the idea. It doesn't take Geralt long to realize that she's the one who takes people by the hand, and that she's long been hot on his trail. He even shows a degree of acceptance and willingness to go with her, as in his dream he had thought that his Yennefer had died. I find it interesting that in this same short story, Geralt also runs into his mother and adopts the young orphan Ciri, both of which, and Yennefer for that matter, have all introduced significant elements of chaos into his life. But consider for instance that the act of giving birth is a gift from the void of chaos, full of potential, which can only be realized if order is imposed upon it in a meaningful way. The same goes for death. It can create a situation of chaos for those still living, especially if it's the father that dies. In that situation, it's the son who has to take that chaos and create a new order, a new father, and that's how it's gotta be sometimes. Sometimes the chaos is a much needed opportunity. The Holy Spirit both enchants the son, the hero, with her beauty, motivating him to strive to be worthy of her, and also she bears dangerous gifts of chaos. Trust me, the ancients knew about female shit tests. And by the way, I think it's kinda sad that in classical times, death was a woman's loving embrace, while to the Romans, it was the god Saturn, who was also the god of time and held a reaping scythe. He's so industrial and efficient, you know, like an old folks home. So for the Celtics, in a world a little beyond ours, was the land of maidens. This is a place, usually represented as an island, that is other than our own, a source of feminine chaos. This place has gone by different names in different centuries, but the one we're most interested in is Avalon, which is Latin for the Island of Apples. This island features a bounty of good food, with no need to toil to obtain it. But never mind that, I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't you like to be the one guy in a paradise full of women? Well, I did tell you that this place is a source of feminine chaos. All the women on the island of Avalon happen to be sorceresses, so you can't really dominate them in any way. And it's not like they're stuck on the island, they can go out and get a man if they want. So how are you gonna impress the sorceress? Like, do you think hypergamous instincts are gonna slow down any in the heart of feminine chaos? Anyways, one of these maidens from the other side is Vivienne, better known as the Lady of the Lake. It's her who tests Arthur, seeing if he fears the other side, before gifting him him the sword Excalibur. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You see, this was an unstable time for Britain. The Romans had just pulled out of the island, leaving behind some of their language and customs, but none of the stability that their domineering occupation gave to the Britons as a silver lining. And with the power vacuum they left in their wake, it was now a true dark age, a land of gangs and warlords fighting constant skirmishes over territory and power. And even among the general population, there was a rise in lawless behavior. Although many families were already checked into that serf life, and despite many medieval towns having homicide rates similar to that of modern US cities, their lives really didn't change much through all this, as they remained important utilities to whoever was in charge. In general, and in spite of, and also due to all the infighting, the people of Britain lacked military capabilities, as they had been compelled to be reliant on the protection of the Roman legions, who had either killed or absorbed most of their best warriors for generations. What they did leave behind was Roman cultural staples like bathhouses, and you can't build a proper army with bathhouses, or can you? It was an age of weakness and strife, and outsiders would also begin to take advantage of this weakness. To the north of Hadrian's Wall, which marked the northern boundary of the former Roman conquered territory, were the Picts and the Gales, or Scoti, and with no forces to man the wall anymore, they began to raid, ravage, and plunder the Britons, and it was pretty one-sided. The Scots of Caledonia, who had kicked the Romans back to Hadrian's Wall and possibly destroyed the entire 9th Legion, had in the process developed the framework for an alliance of the tribes for mutual benefit, which was another advantage they used to keep kicking the feet out from under the Britons. So the Briton nobles began to send desperate messages to Rome for military aid, for old time's sake. All they got in return was some wishy-washy half-promises and excuses about how the Romans had their own problems. Woe to the conquered, and boo-hoo to the conquered and dumped, I guess. To be fair though, Attila had really grinded the Romans down, and they were in their decline now. So to them, the Britons were of more use as a new Hadrian's Wall, made of squishy human flesh. In these dark and desperate times, it is said that the Brittonic king Vortigern turned to the Saxons, and also the Angles and Jutes, but they were often all referred to as Saxons for simplicity's sake. And also, Saxon basically means knife, which you'll see has some thematic value. Vortigern struck a deal with the Saxons where they would fight the Scots and bring more stability to the land, in exchange for them taking control of their own territories in Britain. This arrangement, which by the way was suggested to Vortigern by Satan, and which completely negated the hard-fought victories of his son Vortimer to kick the Saxons out. He also lost his other son Vertigen, who was so pure he never had sex standing up. Worked quite well at first, in a wishful thinking, you haven't disappointed me yet grace period sort of way, but the Saxons kept steadily demanding more for their services, more territory and more positions of power. But Brittonic women were supposedly not demanded because the Anglo-Saxons wished to look down on them as inferiors. And since they did plan to stay, they didn't want to risk the mixing of blood just so their men could have their fun. So all this tension came to a head with the treason of the Long Knives, where the Saxons met with the Brittonic nobility to discuss their arrangements, only for all the Saxons present to pull out knives that they had hidden in their shoes and massacre 300 Brittonic chieftains. King Vortigern was also present. He was held hostage and then ransomed for massive territorial gains. Wessex, Sussex, Essex, and Nosex, they're all named after the Saxons. And the country itself is named after the Angles tribe, who in turn are named after angling, fishing. So England is the land of the fishermen. Throw in Ireland, you got fish and chips. Vortigern had made pretty much the same mistake that the Romans did, relying on the Germans to maintain his borders. Now, according to the Saxon side, it is said that this event occurred because Vortigern tried to renege on a deal, withholding land that he had already promised them for crushing his enemies, and that this was rectified with noble blood being spilled and the leveraging of a hostage. The fact of it is, though, that either way, both sides knew that Britain was vulnerable, and both sides knew it was time to take action and do something about it. The story gets a bit hazy from here. They don't call it the Dark Ages for nothing, but there was mention of a fierce warrior general named Arthur who defeated the Saxons in 12 battles. When speaking of other warriors, these tales would be like, he was great, but he was no Arthur. There was also a Celtic Roman legionary who won battles across Gaul named Artorius. But these are not the Arthur who would wield the Excalibur. The name was still charging up its power. As for the Saxons, there is historical evidence that, on top of taking territories for themselves in the south, they came to occupy many positions of power in areas where the majority were Britons. Contemporary accounts, perhaps a bit biased, reported that this was a very corrupt society, where the innocent were punished and criminals protected. And also, King Vortigern was noted for not respecting the separation of the peoples. The Celtic men of Britain would freely mix with the Saxon women when they could, to the point where, quote, no one could tell who was a pagan, meaning in this case a Celtic Briton, or a Christian. And Vortigern exemplified this by marrying Redwain, the daughter of the Saxon leader Hengist, while at the same time not giving up, and in fact screwing his own daughter. He must have felt he was completely dominating this situation because he thought with nothing but his dick. Meanwhile, his magic Celtic people became mudbloods and adopted the culture of their invaders, who, as the story goes, did not partake of the Briton women and instead focused on the success of their clans. Hengist was in a position of power, and his sons would also likely have harems of their own, so his clan would be fine. He could afford to sacrifice a daughter to smooth things over with Vortigern for a time, even if he didn't intend to have a long-term alliance between their families. They used to call themselves Britons. Now at most they can say they're British. Like kinda, but not really. Oh, look at me, I'm British. I have my TV license and a thriving street stabbing culture. In Celtic culture of old, the Druids were considered the spiritual, metaphysical, and wisdom from nature experts of their societies. They would spend years in isolation, just trying to communicate with nature, and made themselves useful by practicing medicine and chanting to warriors on the battlefield to fill them with courage and power. Perhaps most concerning to the Romans, though, is that the Druids were also an intertribal organization, communicating with other Druids from far-flung tribes, and being able to organize their efforts with more, theoretically, grand-scale goals in mind. So basically, they were the Club of Rome, but without the Rome, so the Rome decided they had to go. Becoming a Druid is known to have taken many years of training, but they never wrote anything down. So 1, they never had the opportunity to start pushing creepy slogans on the common Celt people. And 2, whatever useful body of knowledge the Druids had remained mysterious, as it could not be easily penetrated. Merlin, short for Merlinus Ambrosius, was one of the last of the Druids, said to be the son of an incubus and a nun. Many tales are told of Merlin which are not very flattering of his character, but later tales showed how he walked the line between wanting genuine good for his people and being completely self-serving. As Merlin points out to Arthur, many in the church and nobility deny the existence of Avalon, simply because it doesn't fit into their narrative. Merlin the Druid and Avalon share the fact that they both have a strong connection to the past of the Celtic peoples of the island, and to outsiders, these roots are both mysterious and frightful. Merlin is a polymath, a master of many arts. He has the engineering knowledge to orchestrate the taking of the massive stones of Stonehenge from Ireland across land and sea to be reassembled in Britain, to serve as a memorial for those slain by the Saxons. According to legend, these stones were first put together by giants, but Merlin moved and reassembled them by instructing those under his command on how exactly to construct and work wooden machines to accomplish this task, implying that Merlin didn't merely stand on the shoulders of giants, but could find ways to equal their feats. Some tales say that he actually just used magic, or commanded his own giants to do this task, but those tales do a disservice to try-hard nerds everywhere, who think in terms of scalability to distract from their own mediocrity and lack of social currency. Recent findings actually do suggest that the stones were moved from their original location, in Wales, to their present location 140 kilometers away in Wiltshire, rather than across the water from Ireland. There's also an old quarry near this original site in Wales, where researchers believe these stones were actually mined. So perhaps the story was embellished or confused slightly, but basically,
I lift things up and put them down.
Merlin was also a master of disguise and foresight, prophecy, and perhaps most potently, he knew how to weaponize female nature, but we'll get to that later. When Merlin was young, King Vortigern, who had recently suffered the defeat and humiliation of the treachery of the Long Knives, had commanded the building of a fortress where he could hold up in the hopes of personally enduring the Saxon invasions. This fortress could not be completed, however, as every night when the workers went to bed, the walls and towers would mysteriously crumble to the ground. This exercise in futility kept happening day after day, so Vortigern took counsel with his most wise advisors. They told him to seek out a young boy who was conceived by no mortal father, and have his blood sprinkled on the foundation of this fortress, believing that this would somehow sate whatever dark force was preventing progress to its completion. Merlin, being the supposed son of a demon, was discovered and brought to the site. There, he was informed that he would be put to death for the sake of this building project, and instead of begging and pleading for his life, the boy Merlin confidently spoke back to the king, with words of power and prophecy, delivering the true reason why the fortress could not be erected. He told the king to have his servants dig underneath the building site, where they would discover a lake containing 2 serpents inside of a tent. Being affected by this boy's sudden air of authority and unlikely prediction, the king's servants dug and discovered there was indeed a lake and a tent, and a white and red serpent engaged in a struggle with one another. The red, which Merlin described to be the dragon of the native Celtic peoples of Britain, looked weakened and frail, but by sheer ferocity it managed to cast out the white serpent from the tent and chased it into the lake. The white serpent was the dragon of the invading Saxons, and the tent the kingdom of Britain. The clown world meme was a lot more deep back then. Merlin told Vortigern that while these dragons still fought, and while Saxons still held territory on the island, he had no right to build a fortress on territory which he still held to hide away in. He must claw back his people's lands from the Saxons, and only in retaken territory may he build a fortress which will stand for him. And to cap it off, Merlin also predicted the coming of King Arthur, who would completely overshadow the legacy of Vortigern, pushing back the Saxons and creating a short-lived golden age for the Britons before they are completely swallowed by the Germanic hordes. The red dragon will become the flag of the Welsh, and the white dragon of the Saxons would slowly fall into disuse, until the ones remaining on the mainland would join their Germanic cousins in their love of eagles and hamburgers. Vortigern was just not worthy to create a golden age for the Britons. He lived for the pleasures of the flesh, including even his own daughter. He was neither wise nor courageous, and again, he took counsel from Satan, himself being an agent of punishment on the Britons for their sins. And let me just clear something up real quick. Sins are the same concept as hamartia, or missing the mark, being out of balance. To live in sin is to be so out of balance with priorities and impulses that things just keep getting worse. For example, the sin of gluttony leads to obesity and other related diseases, which weakens the body and mind, making you less useful to your family and less of a pillar to your community. And when enough people in a society live in sin, it inevitably brings a great punishment upon them. Satan is the adversary who played to Vortigern's weakness and made things worse, while Merlin, that son of the devil, at least demanded strength out of the wretched king, mostly so that he doesn't ruin the druid's plans for the kingdom with his sheer fucking hubris. Vortigern, also known as Grethrin the Thin, as his body was quite frail, is said to have been cursed by a saint for his sinful ways and to have died from a fire that came from the heavens. So he was basically not that guy, and he had every transmissible disease that his cock's blood could nourish at once, and then one more. The next king of note was Uther Pendragon, in whose presence Merlin would appear. Uther was thirsty for Igraine, the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, so Uther strikes a deal with Merlin where he would be disguised as Igraine's husband, and appear before her at a time when the Duke was not home to unleash his passions. Her real husband, rather conveniently, died on the battlefield at around the same time. That one night of passion was enough to satisfy Uther, until it wasn't anymore, and he convinced Igraine to be with him officially and in his honest form so that she could maintain her standard of living. And 9 months later, baby Arthur popped out of her. There's kind of an implication here that a baby conceived by a man going to great lengths and releasing a great deal of passion in one night will be stronger and have a stronger fate than others. Merlin must have recognized this opportunity and knew that it was time to be a little devil and grease the wheels. As for Uther, he would eventually die in a battle, and his royal sword would be sealed in a stone, basically using the land of Britannia itself as a sheath and a seal on the kingship for young Arthur to eventually release, taking up his father's status without skipping a beat. Merlin made sure that the legend that the one who pulls the sword would be crowned the rightful king would spread far and wide, and that many would attempt and fail, where Arthur eventually attempts and succeeds to give the boy an air of legitimacy, and to paint all other lords who vied for the kingship while Arthur was still a child as mere pretenders, who the land of Britain itself would not accept. It was all part of the plan. So this royal sword of the Britons served well in Arthur's hands. He would crush and dismantle a coalition of rival small kingdoms while wielding it, although this did have the unfortunate side effect of making the roads more unsafe, as wandering former knights from these broken kingdoms would extort and murder to get by. This problem was epitomized by one known as the Black Knight, who was blocking passage through a wooded area and gained a reputation for being truly formidable. After nearly getting one of his prospective knights killed by assigning the Black Knight as a trial, Arthur, going against the advice of Merlin, ventured out to face this champion of melanated plate himself. And by the way, King Arthur's court was supposedly surprisingly diverse for an age when traveling to faraway lands would often take years and the facing of many perils. So I thought I should mention that it was really nice of those black guys to help King Arthur with his race war. First, Arthur and the Black Knight joust, and Arthur shows his valor, but is ultimately knocked off his horse. He then pulls out his royal sword. The Black Knight dismounts and obliges in kind. What follows is an absolute kitchen disaster. Arthur gets a word of respect from the knight for his refusal to be broken in spirit, but physically, he's merely enduring the Ernie Shavers treatment. Arthur is now badly injured despite his armor, and his royal sword, which had carried him all this way, cutting down most foes like butter and enhancing his royal charisma, is shattered. He only escapes the finishing blow by a fluke, being dragged away after getting caught up in the stirrups of his fleeing horse. So Merlin finds Arthur in his sad state, and while delivering his I told you so's, starts leading him towards a lake. There they meet Morgan le Fay, the leader of the ladies of Avalon, and also Vivaine, the lady of the lake. Both of these enchantresses would at some point study the secret druid arts under Merlin, in exchange for possibilities. It is unclear whether Merlin actually got some fairy pussy. Le Fay means the fairy, but it is clear that he was playing with chaos itself by making these enchantresses stronger. In some tellings, Vivaine would go on to betray Merlin outright, using the magic he taught her to either trap or destroy him. As for Morgan le Fay, who was Arthur's half-sister on top of being an embodied fairy, she would have an affair with Arthur, and ultimately plot his downfall over her jealousy for his beautiful wife Guinevere. So I mentioned earlier that Merlin knew how to direct female nature in a direction that suits his ends. Well, let me tell you, he didn't simply get played by these two Avalonians. Merlin knew that it is not in female nature to teach and empower men. so he felt that his secrets would be safe and he would not ultimately create competition for himself over using these powers to leverage women into his bed, as long as he only teaches women. Notice how he doesn't teach any of these secret arts to Arthur, only just enough to keep the young king alive and useful to him while he pulls the strings. The other thing about empowering women like this and unleashing them on the world is that it also actively weakens his competition due to female hypergamy and the desire to create chaos to find the strongest man. Merlin might have gotten caught up thinking with his staff a little too much for his own good, but he had a game plan in mind when selecting his students. I know it sounds a little, petty, but really there's no point in empowering your enemies who will just take and use your inventions and ideas and give you no credit. So on top of everything else, Merlin is a street smart wizard. And by the way, Merlin may have been the other type of wizard too. Some stories say that he was traumatized by war at a young age, and he sought seclusion in the woods for many years, gaining wisdom from nature, only re-emerging when he started hearing that BBC documentary music. You know, when they do a program on some kooky loser lifestyle. I swear that music makes you feel 10 times more suicidal than the Coronation Street theme. Like at that point, he knew he had to go, somehow get some tail and push back the night. Morgan Le Fay has deeper roots in older Celtic stories, and she isn't a fairy exactly, although she was a creature of fate, which is what the Fae in fairies means. The Morrigan was a Celtic goddess who presided over the outcomes on the battlefield and over fate and death in general. She was, like the ladies of Avalon, a keeper of the boundaries of chaos. She is, however, not a dick girl. Even representations of chaos should have their limits. The Morrigan was actually made up of 3 aspects, just as Morgan Le Fay could be at one time a healer, and at another a scorned lover with murderous intent, only to switch back again in an instant. In this particular situation, she offers to heal the injured Arthur, and directs him to enter the lake, where he will meet Vivienne for a test. Similar to how Jesus walks across a body of water to show mastery over the chaos of nature, Arthur is instructed to put himself at the mercy of the Lady of the Lake, being told that she would simply drag him down to drown on a whim if he proves not to her liking. Arthur survives this encounter without flinching, or even taking a single sip of Vivienne's bathwater, and thereby he is deemed worthy to wield the sword Excalibur. The sword is also sometimes called Caliburn, a name which harkens back to the sword Caledbalg, wielded by the ancient Celtic hero Cuchulainn, who was also an incarnation of the Irish god of mastery over the many arts, and particularly he was known for his boldness and his terrifying battle frenzy. In one tale, Cuchulainn had just been married, and the local lord was eager to carry out his traditional rite of the first night, where he has the maiden for her first time before allowing her husband to have her. Cuchulainn was having none of it, but the lord pleaded with him that he must exercise this rite or would undermine his authority and status, and they came to a compromise where the lord would lay between the two on their first night, and the newlyweds presumably started having sex on top of him while he did his best to maintain his air of dignity. Cuchulainn had invented the third wield by making a lord fit to wield the towel for them as they go at it. Cuchulainn was a very consistent man in all areas of life, is all you really need to know. In battle, while wielding the sword Caledbalg, which may have meant hard lightning, Cuchulainn performed such feats as defending an entire province from incursion single-handedly, and the sword was generally known to be capable of defeating entire armies. Another wielder of the sword, Cuchulainn's uncle, Fergus MacRoich, once cut off the tops of 3 hills using a technique called the 3 Great Strikes. This sword is said to have come from fairy palaces, and to become as long as a rainbow when brandished. Now, in Celtic traditions, it was common practice to throw valuables into bodies of water, and especially into lakes considered sacred as a form of sacrifice. This does include a lot of weapons, but also gold and silver. These were offerings to the spirits of the waters, with the surface of the water representing a shimmering portal to that other world, the source of feminine chaos. So when Arthur received Excalibur from these waters, it connected him with his Celtic ancestors. His royal sword might not have been up to the task, but now he wielded the power of his ancestors. The sword has gone by different names in earlier tellings, such as the Welsh Caledfwich, which may share similar name origins as the Irish Caledbalg, and then it was Caliburn, a name which some now attribute to the royal sword from the stone. Excalibur, which may have meant steel cutter, was a massive upgrade over Arthur's royal sword. Excalibur was forged in the fairylands, and is thought to be unbreakable by mortal means. It was a tool forged, at least in that form, for only one man. On one side of the blade were written the words, "Take me up," and on the other, "Cast me away." In other words, this gift from the Fae was to be returned when it could no longer serve a purpose in Arthur's hands, and it granted him, for instance, the ability to defeat a battalion of 400 soldiers single-handedly. In Arthur's first battle wielding the sword, is shown with a blinding light, granting him easy victory, but it's not stated to have done that any subsequent times, so that's sort of a new car smell kind of deal. As the name suggests, the sword likely cleaved through them like butter. and may have also possessed an ability similar to Caledbolg's 3 Great Strikes, where Arthur can defeat many enemies with a single swing. And then there's the sword scabbard, which, when worn, prevents Arthur from bleeding from any wounds, which means he's not invulnerable per se, although in some tellings he is, but he can take a lot of otherwise fatal strikes, like some kind of monster. So with this powerful blade in hand, Arthur eventually goes back and defeats the Black Knight, who then joins his round table out of a mutual respect. And Arthur and his knights go on to have many adventures and battles, creating a golden age of Camelot. But unfortunately, good things can't last forever, even if in some tellings, another power of the sheath was to prevent Arthur from aging. The first fracture came when it came to light that Arthur's wife / main squeeze, the Lady Guinevere, had been having an affair with Sir Lancelot, who was supposed to be the picture of romantic chivalry. Lancelot had sworn his loyalty to Arthur, and I think it's pretty safe to assume that this includes not making a cuckold out of his king. But compared to Arthur, he was just the younger, more athletic, passionate, and emotionally engaging guy, who Guinevere, the daughter of the King of Scotland, could not help being infatuated with even before her marriage to Arthur. And Lancelot also had an eye for her. I mean, you could probably fault Lancelot for allowing himself to be in all these situations where he was alone with her, but regardless, it was all part of a bigger game, set in motion by the Fays. Lancelot, who for most of their time together was very much Arthur's right-hand man, was actually raised by Vivienne, the Lady of the Lake. She saw to it that he would become a cultured and impeccable warrior, and then she sent him off to Arthur's court as the White Knight, and she continues to aid him in his early adventures as a Knight of the Round. And once he had made his name, she started subtly pushing Lancelot and Guinevere together. Her desire in doing this has been argued to be to provide Lancelot with some emotional fulfillment, but also to create chaos. Remember where she's from. She may have provided Arthur with the sword to build a strong kingdom for his people, but she also set the wheels in motion to eventually have the sword returned. Now, there's different tellings of what exactly happened after this affair came to light, but the gist of it is, it created a conflict, particularly between Arthur and Lancelot and those who took sides, which greatly reduced the effectiveness of the Round Table and thus the stability and strength of Camelot, and this created an opening for another pawn of the Fays. Morgan Le Fay, in some of the more popular tellings, was actually Arthur's half-sister, with them sharing the same mother, the beautiful Igraine, and Morgan's father being the Duke of Cornwall, and her being a fairy was kind of just a spirit that inhabited her. Now, if you recall, she was trained in sorcery underneath Merlin, or at least he wanted to get on top of her, and she seemed to have specced into being an enchantress, which served her ends well, as she successfully seduced her half-brother Arthur and bore a child as a result named Mordred. She then raises Mordred, who's considered Arthur's bastard son, so he has no claim to the throne, to nonetheless harbor a desire to usurp his father's position as king, and he finally saw his opportunity in the divisions created by Lancelot and Guinevere's affair. So he undermined Arthur's position in any way that he could, and he found allies in the court, as well as striking deals with foreign powers, and doing his best to build his public relations. Like, he was well trained, and by an enchantress no less, so he was a threat.
Don't be a fool, Mordred. You cannot found a kingship on force. You'll be murdered in your own bed.
But the play that really directed Arthur and Camelot towards their ruin was when Morgan Le Fay spirited away Excalibur's scabbard. So when the final battle came to pass, and it was Arthur versus Mordred, Excalibur alone was not enough to preserve Arthur's life. And in fact, in some versions, Morgan Le Fay had switched out the swords, so that Mordred had Excalibur, and Arthur had a fake Excalibur. He did cut down Mordred, but was mortally wounded himself in the fight. And fulfilling the deal, Excalibur was returned to the Lady of the Lake, and Arthur himself, with his strong fate, was sent to Avalon to rest. And legend says he might return one day, when his people are at their time of greatest need. British and English kings have since tried to connect themselves with the legends of Arthur and Excalibur, but the real Excalibur, the sword custom made for Arthur, resides with the Fae. It is described as being phallic in the shape of its blade, and ionic in its handle and hilt, meaning it resembles external female genitalia. Pulled from the womb of chaos by one with a strong fate, and returned upon death, it's a powerful blade, but is it enough to take on the spear of destiny, soaked in the blood of the sun? Well, let's get down to it.
We all had her. Oh, but he married her.
So Arthur and Mordred essentially take each other out at the Battle of Camlan, and even if Mordred had survived, he might have been able to take the throne of Camelot. That doesn't mean he now has the magic touch that built and could maintain it. So either way, Camelot falls into decline until it's just a story from the Dark Ages. But a couple hundred years later, Arthur, resting in Avalon, is called to action once again by the Fae. The Saxons have calmed down a little bit with their attitudes towards his people, and it kinda just is what it is. But now there's a dire new threat, forging a massive empire across mainland Europe. Charlemagne the Great, with his Frankish hordes and the backing of the Roman Church, not to mention his decapitating Technicolor blade, Joyeuse, which incorporates the tip of the Spear of Destiny in its pommel to ensure it finds its mark. Arthur is given his Excalibur, and the sheath, and he's called upon to forge a neo-Camelot to serve as a bastion against the ambitions of this man. However, Arthur didn't have all the advantages that he did back in the day, such as the machinations of Merlin and the name of his father. He had a powerful sword, but he needed something more to forge a kingdom, something like that spear of destiny he keeps hearing about. In fact, why delay the inevitable? Might as well just face this Charlemagne man to man. But he still needed a plan to make that happen. So Arthur travels, displaying his combat prowess and declaring himself the revival of the old legend of Camelot, until eventually he gains himself a couple hundred followers and unites a couple dozen of them. Then they cross the channel and take over a small piece of Brittany. And when the Frankish army shows up to retake that land, Arthur just starts mowing through them on horseback. And when they finally break ranks and flee from this horror, Arthur demands that they send a message for Charlemagne that they are destined to cross paths, and they will find out whose destiny is stronger. So some time passes, but eventually a massive army forms around Arthur's little encampment in northern France, and Arthur is invited to come speak with Charlemagne directly on neutral ground between the two armies. There, Charlemagne commends his skill as a warrior and offers him the means and position to take over and rule England in his name. He could be Lay Baron of England. In truth, Charlemagne had not actually been planning on taking over England at all, but all this talk about Camelot had piqued his interest, and to sweeten the deal, he offered Arthur not the, but a spear of destiny. He spanked the pommel of his sword Joyeuse with this spear, and he tells Arthur that with this spear, destiny would make a way for his nouveau Camelot. A reasonable compromise, thinks Arthur, until he remembers how the Fays warned him about these copy spears, how they will bend his destiny to the greater destiny of the wielder of the Master Spear, which means that the destiny of his people and a new Camelot would ultimately remain at the mercy of this man in front of him. That is, if he even had time or the inclination to pay the Welsh any special attention. But Arthur would just not be satisfied with what the Fays had preconditioned him to see as a precarious situation. So in a grand gesture, he draws his sword and chops off the head of this copy spear, and then he strikes a few poses with Excalibur, telling Charlemagne this is where my destiny begins and ends. And then he looks at Joyeuse and says, "But as one warrior to another, I'll duel you for your sword, and you me for mine." To which Charlemagne responds, "How about you for yours and go home?" And Arthur responds, "My home was a gilded place of romance and chivalry, but I don't deny the ruthless deeds that laid its foundations. Now have at you, Frankish king, parody of Augustus, it's time you met your Caesar.
You do not get to decide my fate!"
And so Charlemagne finally draws Joyeuse, which shines with a dazzling red light, and he says, "Those Saxons who massacred your Britain nobility and now dominate the island, I've massacred Saxons here on the mainland, and it's nothing like your little island folk battles. There's always another enemy on the horizon." In response, Arthur pulls out a cloth and a bottle of Avalonian sword polish, and while rubbing his sword carefully but vigorously, he says, "Well then, this should be just another Tuesday, right? More like, just another Fool's Day," and they finally clash.
A lot of they fight.
Both Excalibur and Joyeuse are shining brightly, and neither of them can really see what they're doing. Now, Charlemagne didn't have an overall imposing frame, but he was known to be tall, so he did have the reach advantage. And between their wild blind swings, he was getting the better of Arthur with his powerful blade. He pierced through Arthur's suspiciously advanced for the era armor, leaving small cuts in his flesh here and there, but they didn't bleed, while every connecting blow of Excalibur cleaved right through and did draw blood. And as they put their sunglasses on and their eyes gradually adjust to the light, Arthur begins to pile on the pressure by being willing to trade blows, knowing he would get the better of Charles each time. But there is one specialty of Joyeuse that Arthur cannot just tank. The sword's luminance turns to an icy blue as Charlemagne loads up, and he launches a lightning-quick decapitation strike. But Arthur, trusting in his weapon, simply holds it out for Charles to pierce himself on, so that decapitation gets reduced to Charlemagne simply batting away Excalibur, and in the process causes a chip in his blade. Charlemagne looks at his now imperfect blade with sadness as it turns a sickly yellow. He orders his attendants, who had just been standing there the whole time dumbfounded, to attack Arthur, and in the few seconds that his elite royal guard by him, he takes apart and removes the true spear tip from the pommel of Joyeuse, and reconnects it to the rest of the true spear, which he always has near, that saves in his saddlebags. Arthur Pendragon approaches, his sword soaked in blood and no longer shining. He's like, "That's it, isn't it? The true spear. It's more of an artifact than a weapon, but all I need is destiny.
And I'll be in control of my destiny. For the first time."
And so the fight continues, and it's actually really difficult to face a spearman with just a sword. Arthur is doing his best to deflect and avoid Charlemagne's thrusts while looking for an opening, but he's eating a lot of blows and being backed up. He started this fight as a Chad Light, but now he's a low-tier normie, and Charlemagne keeps pressing him, trying to completely disable his body. They go down a valley and into a shallow river. Arthur has been trying to cut through the spear shaft for quite a while now, but his strikes just never seem to quite land right. But he does have something going for him. He hasn't bled a drop this whole fight. While Charlemagne, who was known to be somewhat frail, has been bleeding for quite a while now, and wielding a spear is quite tiresome when you have to keep recovering from having your blows parried. So he's breathing heavy, his posture's getting worse, and his strikes are less frequent. Arthur feels the temptation to just run to the riverbank and start throwing rocks. Then he has a better idea. He runs upstream and plunges Excalibur into the first large boulder that he sees. And while stripping off his armor, he declares, "Only he who can remove this sword may call himself the rightful king of these lands." And then he steps forward and says, "But first you'll have to get through me to claim it." And then he starts throwing rocks, forcing the already exhausted Charlemagne to rush forward to close the gap. And with a mighty thrust, he goes to spear Arthur in the groin. But Arthur gets low and instead takes it in the abdomen, clean through. Arthur grips the shaft, and as hard as he can, he kicks out that beanpole's legs. As he goes down, Charlemagne can feel his destiny slipping. Arthur takes Excalibur's sheath off of his hip, and for just a moment, he lets go of it before gripping it again. And now the spear, which he's painstakingly removing from his abdomen, is soaked in his blood. He then retrieves Excalibur as Charlemagne's men arrive and set upon him, and as he fights to break through them, he leaves Charlemagne to his doom, knowing full well that holding destiny in your hands will have some deadly withdrawal symptoms. So that's it. I think Excalibur wins because it's like the candle that burns brightest. Camelot didn't last long, but it was a glorious sparkling thing, which rose out of a land of chaos, civil wars, and invasions. And it was never meant to last. Excalibur was a borrowed thing from chaos itself. While the spear is built out of sacrifice towards a new order, it can build a lasting empire for one who can hold on to it, but it's a slow burner. And if it can be interrupted by something as simple as a river crossing, then you're not exactly walking on water. And by that same token, you're not immune to Excalibur rising up from the waters and cutting you to pieces. So I hope you enjoyed the video, guys, and remember to wear a condom. Always wear protection, because otherwise, your sword will end up becoming rusty.
I'm calling you out, Charles. The spear shall be mine.
Appelle monsieur le président de la République ou monsieur. D'accord? Voilà. C'est bien. Et tu fais les choses dans le bon ordre. Si le jour où tu veux faire la révolution, tu apprends d'abord à avoir un diplôme et à te nourrir toi-même. D'accord? Et à ce moment-là, tu iras donner le leçons aux autres.
Very funny, Charles. I once again propose a fight to the death.